Hey there, and welcome back to Boring History for Sleep. Before we begin, take a moment to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you. But only if you really enjoy this type of content. Tonight, we're traveling back to feudal Japan. Not to battles or legends, but to the quiet, difficult life of a peasant. A world where you couldn't leave your village, rest was rare, and taxes came for everything you grew. There were no choices, no weekends, just routine, rules, and quiet resignation. So dim the lights, get comfortable, and let's drift into a day you likely wouldn't last, but others endured for a lifetime. Imagine starting your day with a shock so cold it feels like your very soul has been yanked out of your body. Not metaphorically, either. Picture yourself being jolted awake by an icy splash of water. No warning, no compromise. That was the reality of mornings in feudal Japan. But here's the kicker. This wasn't about just waking yourself up after hitting some kind of imaginary snooze button. It was about proving you were clean, pure, and spiritually ready to exist in a world that judged you every second of the day. Now, you might think, okay, people take baths all the time. What's the big deal? The big deal was that this was more than hygiene. Cleanliness, back then, was essentially its own religion. Everyone from the highest-ranking samurai to the most overworked peasant was expected to abide by the same set of unspoken but immovable rules. Water had this symbolic role. It wasn't just water. It was purification for the body, the spirit, and maybe your reputation. Because smelling bad or looking unkempt wasn't just gross. It was offensive. And not offensive like your co-worker avoids the desk next to yours offensive. Offensive like society will collectively decide that you are a failure. But let's get practical for a second. Think about the tools we take for granted today. Body wash, hand soap, even little conveniences like hot running water. Those weren't exactly waiting in the corner of their homes. Soap, as we know it, was almost non-existent for most people during this period. At its best, it was a crude combination of plant ash or herbs, and at its worst, well, you didn't use anything at all. Water did the heavy lifting, and when I say water, I mean the closest stream or bucket someone managed to fill. This wasn't heated for comfort. No one cared about thermal relaxation in January. In summer, sure, freezing baths might have felt tolerable, but winter, you'd be clenching your teeth so hard they'd feel like they were part of the ice itself. For samurai, the stakes were especially high. Cleanliness tied directly to honor, and honor wasn't some vague, optional personality trait like we think of it today. For them, it was literally life or death. If you couldn't maintain appearances, you weren't just embarrassing yourself. You were embarrassing everyone you represented. Your family, your name, your lord. It wasn't unheard of for sloppiness to result in shame so severe you'd either be cast out entirely or put in a position where making up for it involved some, let's call it, extreme measures. Because let's not forget, if you're a samurai, anything less than immaculate clothing, spotless presentation, and meticulous grooming is considered as good as a neon sign saying, "I don't care about my honor, and neither should you." Now, try to picture yourself in their shoes, or rather, in their soggy sandals. You wake up before the sun has even risen. It's dark, it's freezing, and your body's already stiff from lying on a straw mat all night. Your first task? Drag yourself outside to find the nearest clean water source to pour all over yourself. Do you scream when the first splash hits? Do you look around to make sure no one sees your trembling hands? It's okay. In this scenario, you've already failed by modern standards. But in their time, you'd be expected to straighten up, carry on, and act like this was the most normal thing ever. And don't think for a second that skipping out on this was an option. Skipping wasn't rebellion, it was social suicide. Even peasants, who arguably had less to lose in terms of prestige, didn't get a pass. Staying clean wasn't something society hoped you'd take seriously. It was an absolute requirement. Sweat stains, an overgrowth of unkempt facial hair, dirty fingernails. Those were gateways to being labelled lazy or immoral. It wasn't just about your personal hygiene. It was a reflection of your role in the order of things. Appearances back then weren't skin deep. They were everything. Being spotless told the world you took your life, and more importantly, your place in society, seriously. So let's talk about what clean actually looked like. There weren't showers or baths as we know them now, and water wasn't an unlimited, freely available resource for everyone. For many, particularly the peasants, cleaning up might have meant a quick rinse in a shallow stream, or pouring whatever they'd managed to collect in buckets. And while samurai or wealthier individuals had more access to water, and perhaps even dedicated areas for bathing, they weren't comfortable by today's standards. Nobody was lighting scented candles or sitting in marble tile tubs. Think rugged, bare-bones conditions for the privileged. But even after that splash of cold water, your day wasn't over before breakfast. That was just step one. Maintaining cleanliness was a full-time effort. Samurai, for example, carefully groomed themselves to remove not just visible dirt, but any sign of weakness or disorder. That morning, cleanse set the tone. If your robes were wrinkled, if your hair wasn't tied correctly, or if the slight stench of sweat lingered on your skin, the message was clear. You weren't serious, and not being serious about your appearance was seen as not being serious about your duties. For a group of people obsessed with perfection, it would have been like openly admitting you didn't really care about your job, or your life for that matter. And yes, I can feel the thoughts rolling around in your mind. What about the peasants? Surely they were cut some slack. After all, they didn't exactly have the same level of responsibility or expectation. But no, this wasn't about equality or fairness. Expectations trickled down. While it's true that peasants didn't have to meet the same precise standards as samurai, they were under just as much pressure to stay clean, relative to what people of their class could reasonably achieve. Think about the sheer physical labor of working in rice paddies all day. You're knee-deep in mud, baking under the sun, with no easy access to things like towels or scented soaps to tidy up after you're done. At night, you'd rinse off as best as you could and hope your neighbors didn't find your efforts lacking. And this wasn't just about keeping up appearances for fun. It was almost philosophical. Cleanliness and purity were deeply spiritual concepts in Japanese culture. Water was believed to cleanse not just the body but the spirit, washing away impurities both seen and unseen. If that sounds intense, that's because it was. Any failure to maintain these standards didn't just put a target on you as lazy or unhygienic. It marked you as someone spiritually negligent. And spiritually negligent, in the eyes of society, often translated to untrustworthy or even dangerous. So imagine yourself realizing that no matter how hard you scrub yourself, no matter how much water you pour over your shivering body, it'll always feel like there's some invisible expectation you haven't quite met. Because this wasn't just about the act of washing up in the morning. It was proving, outwardly, that you were someone worthy of respect, or at least not deserving of outright scorn. For samurai, it was tied to their very identity. For peasants, Failing here could be all it took to lose what little face they had left. And this wasn't a once-in-a-while ordeal. This was every single morning, before anything else, before food, before work, before even opening your mouth to speak most of the time. And if you're sitting there wondering if you'd crumble under the pressure after a single week, you're not alone. Most of us, accustomed to comforts like warm running water and soap that doesn't smell like boiled bark, probably wouldn't have survived. The irony, of course, is that they'd probably look down on us just as much for being unable to function without our modern conveniences. By now, you're probably starting to appreciate just how easy we have it. Your morning routine might feel chaotic when you're rushing out the door with half a bagel in your mouth. But at least you're not stumbling around trying to wash freezing water off your face while worrying about whether your reputation could survive the slightest misstep. So the next time you step into a steaming hot shower, grateful for the endless supply of soap, shampoo, and comfort, just take a moment to imagine what mornings in feudal Japan might have been like. Chances are, you'd give up on the whole thing long before breakfast, shivering in defeat on the floor of a wooden house. But before you think mornings were the only hurdle back then, don't get too comfortable. Every moment of the day brought its own trials, and for the samurai, the real struggle was living up to their unrelenting code. Think being a samurai was all sword fights, glory, and epic battles. It wasn't. The reality was much heavier. A life of constant vigilance, where every action, every word, and even the way you carried yourself was under scrutiny. And the standard? Absolute perfection. Every move had to align with the rules of Bushido, or the way of the warrior, a strict code that governed a samurai's entire existence. To live as a samurai wasn't just about wielding a sword. It was about embodying an ideal. Honor, loyalty, and discipline weren't suggestions. They were demands. And failure to meet them, that could cost you everything. Now, before you picture yourself strolling around as a samurai, slicing bamboo for fun, let's get something straight. This wasn't some romantic warrior lifestyle. Samurai didn't live for their own happiness. They existed as extensions of their lord. A samurai wasn't just a person, they were a symbol. Every mistake they made reflected on the person they served. This meant that slipping up wasn't just a personal issue. It was public humiliation. For one misjudged bow, one unevenly tied sash, or even an out-of-place smirk at the wrong time, you'd be considered a failure not only to yourself, but to your entire clan. And if you're wondering how serious that is, let me remind you of something called seppuku. Ritual suicide might sound extreme, but it wasn't a rare occurrence. It was a required act of atonement if a samurai brought dishonor to themselves or their lord. So imagine drifting through your day, knowing that every raised eyebrow, every footstep, and every spoken word could be silently judged against this unrelenting standard. You'd essentially be walking a tightrope from morning to night. And the worst part, this pressure to perform didn't go away, not even behind closed doors. It followed you everywhere. Even in private moments, you were practicing your stance, your manners, or maybe even your sword techniques, because perfection wasn't just the goal, it was survival. And if that feels suffocating, think about the demands of their training. Sure, samurai were warriors, but they didn't spend their days endlessly charging into battle. Most of their time was spent in preparation for battle that might not even happen. They trained in everything, from swordplay and archery to horseback riding and even poetry. Yes, poetry. Why? Because Bushido demanded it. A samurai wasn't just expected to be a deadly fighter. They were supposed to represent an ideal of refined discipline. They wrote haikus, practiced calligraphy, and studied tactics and philosophy. And none of this was optional enrichment like the extracurriculars we think of today. This was work. Every skill, no matter how seemingly unrelated to combat, was tied back to their core responsibility as warriors and models of discipline. Even their body language wasn't safe from scrutiny. Everything about their appearance and composure had meaning. If you slouched or let your posture falter, that could imply laziness or disrespect. So you'd have to walk, sit, and even stand with an almost unnatural level of focus and precision. Picture yourself holding on to stiff, perfect posture for hours without relaxing. Not at dinner, not while talking to friends, not even while waiting for something. Because one slip, 1 second of looking too casual, and people might start whispering, how could someone so careless in posture be trusted on the battlefield? And about those battlefields, they weren't exactly the weekly action-packed free-for-alls you might imagine. In fact, many samurai never even fought in large wars. Despite their intense focus on combat, samurai weren't constantly in battle with swords drawn. Most of their existence was spent maintaining order, following bureaucratic duties, or serving their lord in day-to-day matters. The overwhelming majority of their stresses came not from the thrill of combat, but from the demands of representing their lord's will in everything they did. You might call this boring. For them, it was a terrifying game of perfection that never ended. Mistakes weren't forgiven either. Imagine facing a furious daimyo, your feudal lord, because you bowed 2 degrees too low or too high, accidentally offending their honor. And let's say it's not long before this situation snowballs. Public shame could follow. You'd likely be asked to resolve the situation on your own, meaning seppuku would be looming over you. The ritual wasn't just about dying. It was about dying correctly. The process itself was supposed to demonstrate grace under pressure, a final moment of dignity that upheld Bushido even as you drew your last breath. If you think that's grim, that's because it was. This wasn't a code designed for guilt-free survival. It was designed to enforce impossibly high standards with zero room for error. And these expectations didn't relax based on age or physical condition. Even older samurai, who were no longer on the battlefield, were held to the same expectations for loyalty and conduct. As long as you were alive, you were expected to embody the ideal, even if your sword hand wasn't what it used to be, or your eyesight had begun to fail. Retirement wasn't a concept, and relaxation was a foreign idea. All that training, learning, and careful self-perfection from youth onward wasn't going to let you off the hook just because you'd aged. You lived as a symbol till you died as one. But let's not overlook the sheer mental weight of this lifestyle. To live as a samurai was to train your mind to suppress anything that didn't serve Bushido. Fear, laziness, self-centered thoughts. Stoic composure was the name of the game. If you felt fear before a daunting task, forget about showing it. In fact, failing to suppress negative emotions could reflect just as badly as more tangible mistakes. If someone sensed your hesitation or dread, it told the world you weren't disciplined enough to handle your role. An emotion wasn't just brushed aside, it was completely repressed. They had to live as if their actions were scripted. Anything unscripted was dangerous. Now, maybe you're thinking, surely not every samurai lived up to this standard. And you'd be right in theory, not everyone succeeded. But unlike society today, where failure can sometimes be written off as human error, in this world, it was treated as a moral failing. Plenty of samurai cracked under this constant pressure. The truly horrifying part of this system was how it didn't let up, not for anyone. If you messed up, the The consequences were steep. If you succeeded, congratulations. You were expected to maintain that exact level of perfection forever. No mistakes, no excuses, no days off. Even on your best day, you were still judged by the possibility that your next one could be worse, or your last. And remember, they weren't just representing themselves. A samurai was seen as an extension of their lord status. Your honor reflected your daimyo's ability to lead, so every day was essentially performance review day. Every decision, no matter how small or personal, was weighed with the understanding that your failure could ripple up to insult your entire house. And the pressure this created wasn't limited to the individual samurai. It affected their families, their retainers, and their clans. This chain of accountability meant that staying flawless wasn't selfish. It was expected to protect everyone around you. So let's bring that idea back to you for a second. Imagine being handed a sword at a young age and told, from this moment on, every second of your life will require mastery of everything. Your thoughts, your skills, your clothes, even the way you sit. Even if you lasted a few days or weeks in gritty training, could you handle the weight of such crushing expectations? Could you force yourself to care that much about every little detail? Could you imagine dealing with that pressure for years, with no way to escape or even take a step back for perspective? No matter how romantic the samurai seem in movies or art, the truth is this: being born into the role was less an opportunity and more a lifelong obligation, one that demanded perfection every moment of every day. One misplaced step, one unsatisfactory bow, and you could be risking humiliation, or worse. Making it through a single day without error was an accomplishment. A week, a miracle. So if you think your modern-day stress, emails, meetings, deadlines is relentless, maybe take a second to appreciate how lucky we are not to have Bushido hanging over every word and action. The anonymity we often take for granted today would have been a gift to anyone living under that code. Being a samurai wasn't just about skill or toughness. It was about weathering a lifetime of unrelenting pressure. One day in their sandals, and you'd be begging for that casual desk job you once resented. Of course, as crushing as this way of life was, samurai still held a privileged position in society. But what about those at the very bottom? The peasants who worked themselves to the bone for no glory and even less freedom. Let's see how life treated them. Imagine opening your eyes to another morning that looks exactly like the last. A faint grey light trickling into your small, sparse home. The smell of damp earth clinging to your clothes. And a long day of back-breaking labour ahead. Except, unlike today's alarm clock-driven rush or commute, you're waking up with the knowledge that your entire life is anchored to one unchanging truth. You can't leave. Not for a day, not for an hour, and not without explicit consent. A permission you'll never get. This wasn't confinement in the way we think of it today. There were no fences or iron locks. But make no mistake, the peasants of feudal Japan lived in a prison of land, laws, and tradition. A prison without bars. Peasants made up the largest class in feudal Japan. A critical piece in a hierarchy they had no power to escape. They were the backbone of the economy, producing the rice and goods that kept society functioning. Yet their role as providers didn't earn them comfort or respect. Instead, it locked them into a system that kept them tethered to their villages, dictated every decision they made, and drained them of what little they earned. Leaving their village was more than frowned upon. It was illegal. The land they worked on wasn't theirs. It belonged to the daimyo, their feudal lord. And stepping away from it, even temporarily, was seen as not just disobedience, but as a threat to the fragile order of feudal society. A threat punished harshly. Think about that for a second. Imagine waking up in the same place every day, knowing that the horizon, the world beyond your rice fields, is unreachable. Nothing changes. The seasons might rotate, but the work stays the same. You plant, you grow, you harvest. Because these tasks, endlessly repeated, are what keep food on the table. Except, here's the part that really stings. The rice you spend your entire day sweating over, that's not for you. It's for the daimyo. Technically, it's also for the samurai, the tax collectors, the bureaucrats, basically everyone holding rank above you. Their comfort, their meals, and their luxuries flow directly from your labor. And by the time you've paid the required taxes, measured in baskets of rice, you're left with just enough to survive, barely. The taxation system was unrelenting. Whatever you grew, whatever you produced, it wasn't really yours. You handed over the majority of your harvest to satisfy obligations to the daimyo, leaving your family to scrape by on what remained. In good years, this stretching of resources might have been manageable. But what about when the rains came too early or too late? Or when a typhoon wiped out an entire harvest season? Did taxes ease up then? Not a chance. These weren't proportional taxes based on success. They were fixed expectations, collected whether or not you had anything left to give. Failure to deliver meant swift punishment, and not the kind that's negotiable. Picture yourself bent over in a rice field, ankle deep in muck, your muscles aching as the midday sun beats down on you. The heat feels like it's pressing the air out of your lungs, and yet there's no slowing down. A single wasted moment could lead to a smaller harvest. A smaller harvest means fewer grains of rice for taxes. Fewer grains for taxes could mean the difference between being left alone or having more soldiers sent to your home to set things right. The balance was so fine it almost wasn't a balance at all. One bad season and the whole system would tip. And make no mistake, speaking out about these conditions wasn't an option. The peasants weren't just trapped physically, bound to their villages and land. They were also bound socially. Resistance, rebellion, or even mild protest was out of the question. Anything that remotely hinted at disobedience could be met with harsh consequences. Tax collectors and officers rarely stopped at issuing warnings. If you dared to speak out of turn or question the logic behind the relentless demands, you'd face punishments that were as swift as they were brutal. You could be whipped, exiled, or promoted to corpse. Let that phrase hang in the air for a moment. Promoted to corpse. Just imagine the tension of knowing that one misspoken word, one look of defiance, one step out of line, could end your life or the lives of those you cared about. Peasant life was dictated not by personal ambition, but by the unrelenting rhythm of nature, tradition, and obligation. If the rice fields required your attention, nothing else mattered. Children, elders, and any able body played a role in the process, because this wasn't work you could slack off on. There were no weekends, no downtime to recharge. The pace of labor accelerated during planting and harvest seasons, leaving no time for anything else. They worked from the moment the sun rose, its dull orange light casting long shadows over rows of struggling crops, to the moment the darkness swallowed up the day. There were no shortcuts, no modern tools to lighten the load. Every inch of progress came from the sweat and strain of their own bodies. And those bodies, they weren't exactly cared for. Medicines were rudimentary at best, non-existent at worst. If you injured yourself, a bad cut from a tool, a sprain from a misstep in the fields, you kept working. Health and rest weren't treated as priorities because survival left no room for either. Let's pause for a moment here. Think about your own life. Something as simple as a weekend. Time to relax, to rest, to step away from your responsibilities. Imagine what it would mean to take that luxury away completely. And not just temporarily, but permanently. Imagine being told that you'll never have a day to yourself because every moment is owed, in some way, to someone else. A lord, a collector, a system. A life like that shrinks down to its barest essentials, work and survival. Everything else, freedom, individuality, happiness, has no room to exist. And even if by some miracle you manage to build a small cushion of resources, extra rice, some tradable goods, it didn't change your place. The rigid class system made sure of that. You couldn't gain rank. You couldn't elevate yourself or your family. The station you were born into, that was where you stayed, no matter how clever or hard-working you might have been. Motivation to excel faded when there were no rewards to aim for, and any thought of climbing the social ladder was a fantasy defeated before it began. For the peasants, life wasn't just unfair. It was controlled to a staggering degree. Even the spaces they moved through were limited. Villages weren't just homes, they were boundaries, and stepping outside those boundaries without permission, not happening. That kind of mobility, the freedom to leave, to explore, to escape, didn't exist. Your village was your world, and your world was small, both literally and metaphorically. And yet, within this harsh, unchanging structure, people endured. Family units leaned on each other for support, creating small moments of joy or connection within their limited means. Festivals, when they happened, were brief moments of reprieve from the monotony and hardship. These moments didn't erase the difficulties they faced, but they dulled the edges, even just temporarily. Traditions passed down through generations connected families to the past, offering small comforts and distractions from the grind. Unfortunately, those breaks were short-lived, and the cycle always returned. Planting, growing, harvesting, taxing, surviving. If you could spend a single day in their shoes, it would feel like an eternity. The sheer weight of physical exhaustion combined with the crushing lack of freedom would make modern life, and not just its comforts, but its choices, feel like a dream. A desk job in an air-conditioned office with weekends off and an affordable food delivery service. That's not just convenience. It's unimaginable luxury compared to the reality of peasant life in feudal Japan. No mobility, no cushion for failure, and no escape. That was the deal. And the system made sure to keep it that way. But as bad as the ceaseless labor and restrictions were, there was one thing they couldn't afford to forget. Their words and their silence alike were dangerous. Speaking out, intentionally or not, was another kind of risk entirely. So even if a peasant somehow endured the physical grind, they still had to survive the minefield of everything they couldn't say. Ever let something slip out of your mouth before thinking it through? Maybe a joke that landed badly, or a comment that didn't come out quite right. It's awkward, maybe a little embarrassing, and you can usually recover with an apology. But in feudal Japan, that same slip could do more than ruin your day. It could end your life. Words weren't just words back then. They were dangerous. Speech in feudal Japan was like walking across a field full of hidden traps. One wrong step, one poorly chosen phrase, and snap. The consequences were immediate and severe. Every word carried weight, not in the abstract way we talk about choosing your words carefully, but in a very real, life-altering way. Context wasn't optional. It was everything. But it wasn't just about speaking politely or avoiding harsh language. The very structure of their society dictated not only what you could say, but how you said it. And breaking these unspoken but very binding rules wasn't a small social faux pas. It was treasonous. And let's be clear here. This wasn't just an issue for the upper classes or public life. This pressure filtered down through every level of society. Even peasants, who were largely invisible in the grand scheme of things, had to navigate these nuances when interacting with anyone of higher rank. If you didn't follow the proper forms of address, if you spoke too informally, or if you even remotely sounded like you were challenging someone of superior status, you risked severe consequences. And by severe, I mean humiliation, exile, or a swift trip to the afterlife, depending on the mood of the person you offended. Let's say you're in a hypothetical village square. You're a farmer, and you've just spent 10 sweaty hours beating stalks of rice in the fields. The tax collector arrives, some local middleman with just enough authority to make your life worse if he feels like it. He demands more rice than you expected, or maybe berates you for not tying your bundles neatly enough. Frustrated, you mumble something under your breath. You're not even directing it at him, just venting. But here's the thing, it doesn't matter. If your tone even hints at sarcasm or defiance, you've crossed a line. That passing remark, that small release of frustration, gets noticed. Before you know it, your neighbors are avoiding eye contact, the tax collector's stare sharpens, and you realize the room has gone silent. No one's going to save you, and now every second that passes feels like walking closer to a cliff edge. It wasn't just about who you were talking to either. Where you stood in the social hierarchy determined how you were expected to speak. Language in feudal Japan was deeply stratified, with specific phrases, structures, and even whole verb forms reserved for different ranks. There were layers upon layers of politeness built into the language itself, each one designed to reflect deference and acknowledgement of status. Think of it as speaking constantly in code, where the stakes for breaking the rules weren't a few raised eyebrows, but literal punishment. If you're a peasant addressing someone of higher rank, for instance, your speech has to drip with humble apologies and disclaimers. But if you're the lord in that scenario, and you speak with anything less than authority, it might be seen as weakness. Everyone, from the highest daimyo to the lowliest farmer, was trapped in this verbal balancing act. Even apologies weren't straightforward. Saying "I'm sorry" in feudal Japan was practically an art form. It wasn't just the words you chose, but how you said them, down to the depth of your bow, the tone of your voice, and the accompanying gestures or offerings. A simple apology could escalate into a performance. Deep bows were expected, your forehead brushing the ground if the offense was serious enough. But that wasn't all. You might also be required to bring a peace offering like a small gift, a decorative comb, a live bird, or something just as symbolic. And heaven help you if your apology was perceived as insincere. A flat tone, even slightly misjudged, could be interpreted not as regret, but as defiance. At that point, your situation would only worsen. And apologies weren't limited to personal misunderstandings. They extended into matters of loyalty. Imagine being a samurai who failed to carry out an order perfectly, or who arrived late due to circumstances beyond your control. Explaining yourself wasn't enough. You'd have to practically abase yourself in front of your lord, pouring every ounce of humility into your words while performing the necessary bows, gestures, and possibly even groveling. And let's not forget, failure to satisfy the expectations of your apology could have deadly consequences. You might be invited to commit seppuku, to restore honor. Yes, Apologizing was literally a life or death skill. It goes without saying that free speech as we understand it today didn't exist. The idea of speaking your mind openly, of criticizing the government or a powerful figure, that would have been unthinkable. Suicidal even. The safest route most of the time was simply silence. Many likely learned from a young age that keeping your thoughts to yourself was easier than navigating the minefield of who would be offended, how much, and what price you'd pay for that offense. And it wasn't just overt insults or outright defiance that got people into trouble. A misplaced joke or an offhand comment could be equally deadly. Let's say, for example, you're sitting around a fire with some fellow villagers. Maybe you make a quick witticism about how much rice the tax collector's been eating, and everyone laughs. Seems harmless, right? Not exactly. If someone in the group feels nervous or insecure, what if they think your joke is aimed at them or is too close to criticizing someone above your social station? That laugh could fade very quickly. The wrong person could take the story to someone with actual power. Gossip spreads faster than wildfire, and soon someone of consequence finds out. A joke that began under the flickering firelight might just carry you into a much darker outcome altogether. If that sounds exhausting, that's because it was. People had to constantly monitor their words, their tone, even their facial expressions to avoid giving offense. And they couldn't relax, not even among family or close friends, because loyalty to one's social superiors trumped personal bonds. If someone overheard you complaining about a particularly cruel landlord or mocking a samurai who had passed through your village, that information could very well make its way back to the wrong ears. The paranoia? Real. Imagine navigating every conversation like a tightrope walker above a pit, knowing the smallest misstep could plunge you into ruin. It wasn't just about avoiding trouble in the moment. It was about anticipating every possible interpretation of your words and preparing for the fallout. The mental toll of such extreme self-censorship is hard to overstate. By today's standards, it would be maddening. Yet, for them, it was simply survival. It's not difficult to see how this rigid control over speech kept the societal order intact. The threat of humiliation, exile, or execution effectively silenced dissent before it could even begin. All the structures of power, the samurai class, the local daimyos, the central shogunate, depended on this tight grip over communication to maintain their authority. The less room there was for people to speak freely, the fewer challenges they faced to their rule. By now, you're probably feeling more grateful than ever for modern freedoms. The ability to speak your mind, even to criticize authority or someone in power, is something most of us take for granted. It's easy to forget how priceless that freedom is until you imagine it ripped away, replaced with a world where silence feels safer than honesty. In feudal Japan, one poorly chosen sentence, one unfortunate turn of phrase, or one sarcastic look could rewrite your entire story, and not in a good way. And yet, as taxing as this constant caution was, it wasn't the only test of resilience people faced. Even if you somehow managed to dodge all the dangers of language and hierarchy, there was still one thing you couldn't escape: the natural world itself. In a land so prone to disaster, sometimes it wasn't words or actions that sealed your fate, but the sheer force of nature. Think you've had a bad weather day. Try living in feudal Japan, where nature wasn't just an inconvenience. It was your landlord, insurance policy, and occasionally your worst nightmare. Typhoons, earthquakes, and floods weren't rare surprises in this part of the world. They were constants, lurking in the background of everyday life, ready to tip everything over without warning. And when they arrived, they didn't politely knock. They roared in, tore everything apart, and left you to figure out the pieces. Surviving one of these disasters wasn't just about grit. It was about learning to live with the fact that disaster wasn't a matter of if, but when. Japan's geography wasn't giving anyone easy breaks at the time. For one, the archipelago sits sprawled across the Pacific Ring of Fire, which isn't quite as exciting as it sounds. This is the area where several tectonic plates meet, jostling and grinding beneath the surface like restless giants. Earthquakes were frequent and unpredictable. You might wake up to a perfectly calm morning, only to feel the ground shift beneath your feet, rattling through wooden homes and sending tiles cascading from rooftops. With no earthquake warnings, the first sign of trouble was, well, the trouble itself. One moment of shaking, and everything you owned could collapse into a pile of wood and dust. If you could get out unharmed, you'd call it a lucky day. But luck didn't fix the damage. Your house. Rebuilding it was on you and whatever help your neighbors could scrape together. Forget national relief efforts. There were no teams swooping in with blankets or temporary shelters. You picked yourself up and got to work, or you risked being exposed to the elements, because nature didn't exactly pause for you to catch up. And then there were the typhoons. Massive storms that visited with a terrifying regularity, as if they were penciled into the calendar. Typhoons, for the uninitiated, make even the fiercest thunderstorms look like light drizzle. These tropical cyclones would barrel in from the ocean, lashing the coast with winds strong enough to tear off roofs and send wooden buildings flying. Torrential rain followed, creating rivers where pathways used to be, and sometimes washing entire villages away. Imagine standing in the middle of one of those storms, watching the thatch on your roof rip away as water pours in from every direction. And that rice harvest you'd spent months growing, gone. Weeks of backbreaking labor destroyed in an instant, reduced to muddy debris floating downstream. Without a harvest, there was no food for your family, but the taxes, still due. Because feudal Japan didn't care if a typhoon had flattened your only source of income. The daimyo wouldn't lower taxes just because you were living on soaked scraps. You were expected to pay up. And how you managed to do that was entirely your problem. Floods, too, were frequent visitors. Heavy rains would swell rivers, overflowing their banks and turning fields into vast, muddy lakes. For a peasant, this might have been the ultimate betrayal. It wasn't enough that tending the rice fields was already grueling. Add an uncontrollable deluge to the mix, and your entire year's crop could be wiped out before you even understood what was happening. The water would rise, livestock would be swept away, and with them went any chance you had of stability. And once the floodwaters receded, they didn't leave behind clean, fresh land. No, they left destruction. Broken houses, sewage-contaminated water sources, and fields too sodden for planting. Starting over wasn't optional, and it certainly wasn't easy. Modern disaster response hinges on planning and infrastructure, but these concepts didn't exist in feudal Japan. No early warnings, no rescue teams, and no emergency plans were in place. If your community faced catastrophic damage, you relied entirely on your neighbors and whatever resilience you could muster. For most, that meant using the simplest of tools to patch up their lives the best they could. If the flood destroyed your food supply, survival came down to rationing what little you had left, or hoping your neighboring village fared better and could spare some rice. But asking for help carried its own risks. Resources were limited for everyone. And generosity often didn't stretch far when disaster came knocking in waves. Even for the samurai class, nature wasn't any kinder. You'd think their higher status might spare them, but no rank could stop an earthquake from leveling a castle or breaking a bridge. Though they were better protected than peasants, living in sturdier homes and with stocks of resources at hand, they weren't untouchable. A typhoon didn't discriminate between the finely polished armor hanging in a samurai's home and the tools stored in a farmer's shed. Samurai might have the manpower to rebuild quicker, but even their resources were finite. Hunger and panic didn't care how sharp your sword was. Throughout history, people living in feudal Japan didn't just experience these disasters, they internalized them. The sheer power of natural disasters was often interpreted as a reflection of divine will. Typhoons weren't just storms, they were seen as forces sent by the gods, sometimes to punish, sometimes to protect. There's even a famous example of this mindset: the Mongol invasions. In the late 13th century, the Mongols tried twice to invade Japan by sea. Both times, typhoons wiped out their fleets, leaving the defenders to credit the kamikaze, or divine winds, for their victory. But while storms could sometimes feel like celestial interventions in favor of the nation, they were far from merciful to the everyday person trying to scrape out a living. For most, those winds weren't divine, they were disastrous. In many ways, coping with disasters became part of the culture itself. Communities had to adopt a sense of resilience, because what was the alternative? If your roof collapsed in a storm, you patched it. If your crops failed or were destroyed, you salvaged whatever you could. If an earthquake flattened your town, you rebuilt, or you left, assuming you had permission to go anywhere. There were no long-term solutions, no effort to address the root of the problem. How could there be? The sheer frequency of disasters made it impossible to keep up with preventative measures, even if they'd had the knowledge or resources to implement them. Think about all the safeguards we take for granted today: seismic building codes, drainage systems, weather forecasting. In feudal Japan, none of these existed. Earthquake-resistant architecture wasn't even a concept. Houses were built with whatever materials were affordable and available. Storm drainage was rudimentary at best, often failing spectacularly when sudden heavy rainfall overwhelmed ditches and natural waterways. And long-term weather prediction, forget it. People relied on observation and gut feelings about the changing seasons, but no one could have predicted the exact timing or severity of a typhoon. Nature didn't just feel uncontrollable, it was unrelenting. The cost wasn't just material either. Natural disasters also cost lives and livelihoods. For a peasant family, a bad typhoon or earthquake could mean starvation. Even if they survived the initial force of the storm, an empty granary in the weeks that followed was just as fatal. Hunger wasn't the only threat, though. Unsanitary conditions following disasters led to outbreaks of disease, further reducing already fragile populations. In a time when healthcare was hugely underdeveloped, even minor wounds could go septic, and a lost crop could cascade into months of malnutrition. Nature wasn't satisfied with a dramatic opening act. The aftermath was often just as cruel, if not worse. What's fascinating, but also heartbreaking, is how people seem to adapt almost to the point of complacency. When living in an environment so prone to disaster, you either learned to endure or gave in to despair. The Japanese concept of shikata ga nai, loosely meaning it can't be helped, captures this attitude. It speaks to a kind of resigned acceptance, an acknowledgement of forces beyond one's control. Why curse a typhoon when that's just how the world worked? Why waste energy resenting an earthquake when the ground beneath your feet was always bound to shift? While this mindset could offer a kind of emotional armor, it was also a stark reflection of the limits of human agency in a highly volatile environment. Now, let's be honest. One typhoon, one earthquake, even one bad flood today, and most people would be scrambling for their phones. Weather apps, evacuation plans, 24/7 news coverage. We've built systems that brace us for the unpredictable. No one's saying modern life has eliminated natural disasters, but at least we're not blindfolded going into battle with them. In feudal Japan, your best preparation wasn't infrastructure. It was your ability to pick yourself up again and again, no matter how many times the wind, water, or earth knocked you down. Of course, nature wasn't considerate enough to call ahead, nor did it adjust its intensity based on what you already had on your plate. A typhoon or earthquake didn't wait to see if you had food security or if your taxes were overdue. Disasters didn't excuse you from other responsibilities, and society certainly didn't lower its expectations in the aftermath. Life continued, no matter what. You'd rebuild your house, replant your crops, and pay your taxes, all while waiting for the next storm, quake, or flood to arrive. Life in feudal Japan wasn't just built around resilience. It relied on an extraordinary familiarity with hardship. But if that sounds overwhelming, consider this. Even in all this chaos, you were still expected to adhere to strict societal norms and appearances. Survival wasn't an excuse to slip up in the eyes of the people around you. Even when whole villages were obliterated, societal roles and expectations stood firm. Because as unforgiving as nature was, the pressure to conform often felt just as relentless. And this brings us to a different kind of judgment, one you wore, quite literally, on your back. Think fashion is just another way to express yourself. Think again. In feudal Japan, your clothes weren't just an outfit. They were a proclamation of who you were, all the way down to your social rank, your job, and even your moral character. Every thread on your back was essentially a walking name tag, and heaven help you if you wore the wrong thing. This wasn't about following trends or avoiding a faux pas at a party. Fashion in this era could quite literally determine your fate. The rules of dressing were more than strict. They were cemented into law. Sumptuary laws dictated everything from the type of fabric you could use to the colors and patterns you were allowed to wear. These weren't subtle suggestions or guidelines for polite society. They were legally enforced standards that kept people in their place. Samurai, silk robes, layered and elegant, with weapons that added to their air of authority. Peasants, simple cotton clothes, dyed in uninspiring earthy tones like browns and greys. And don't even glance at something above your station, because stepping out of line here didn't lead to awkward stares or polite corrections. It led to real consequences. And by consequences, we're talking anything from public humiliation to actual punishment. Imagine you're a hard-working farmer managing to scrounge up enough extra savings to buy a slightly nicer kimono for a festival. Let's say you make the mistake of picking up something with a bold color or a subtly luxurious design. Maybe it's silk, maybe you don't even notice. It just feels soft and looks good. Then you wear it to the event, excited to blend in, or maybe even show a little pride in what you've earned. Big mistake. Before you know it, the higher classes are shooting glares your way, and one of them, perhaps a low-ranking samurai with something to prove, decides to remind you of your error. At best, you're berated for dishonoring the societal order. At worst, you're fined or physically reprimanded. The humiliation alone is enough to make you regret ever wanting something nice. Why such strict rules? Fashion, in this case, wasn't about aesthetics, it was about control. Society in feudal Japan revolved around rigid hierarchy, a layering of statuses where every person had a defined role. These roles were visually obvious to anyone who saw you, and maintaining this visual order kept everyone in their metaphorical lanes. Your clothes didn't just tell people where you fit into the grand scheme of things. They screamed it, boldly and without apology. A samurai walking through the streets, swords clinking at their hip, would look distinctly different from an artisan working in a bustling market, or a laborer trudging home from the rice paddies. It might sound excessive, but it worked as a system. It kept distance between the classes, both literally and figuratively. If your kimono was plain, if your fabrics were rough, and if your colors practically blended with the dirt, you were marked as someone who couldn't even dream of entering more prestigious spaces. And that was kind of the point. There was no pretending you could climb the social hierarchy, and wearing the wrong thing wasn't just wishful thinking. It was viewed as rebellion against a deeply ingrained order. Samurai, at the top of this structure, had their own pressures. Sure, their robes were silk and elegant, but this wasn't casual luxury. Their clothing also spoke volumes about rank and duty. Every detail was deliberate. Deep blues, earthy browns, and the occasional blood-red accent were power moves. These colors weren't random. They showcased their connection to tradition and their readiness for battle. And then, of course, there was the daisho, the paired long and short swords. These weren't just weapons but status symbols. Carrying them improperly, wearing them slightly crooked, or failing to look immaculate in your armor or robes was seen as sloppy, or worse, disrespectful. Peasants, meanwhile, measured their wardrobes in utility rather than style. Cotton was their fabric, breathable and durable for labor in the harsh sun, or knee-deep in the muddy rice fields. Dyeing options were limited. Browns, greys, and beiges dominated. It wasn't like farmers had time to care about fashion trends anyway. But even if they had, the sumptuary laws barred them from wearing brighter colors or intricate patterns. They lived in their clothes, and their clothes lived in the dirt. The purpose was purely practical. Make it usable, make it last, and don't even think about standing out. But practicality didn't shield them from judgment. A rice farmer with a kimono that was too clean, or even just mended a little too neatly, might draw suspicious eyes. Why wasn't their outfit showing honest wear and tear? Were they shirking work somehow? Taking it easy? Even the absence of grime could cause people to whisper. Clothes, it seemed, could betray you just as easily as they could elevate you. And women. The standards for men were complex enough, but for women, it was a whole other game. A woman in feudal Japan wasn't just judged by the fabric of her kimono. Her entire presentation was scrutinized. Hairstyles reflected her status too, with strict rules about what was appropriate for single women, married women, widows, or courtesans. And let's not forget the patterns on her kimono. Did the pattern match the season? Did the color align with local traditions or festivals? Wearing a winter motif in a summer month could embarrass your family, spark gossip among your neighbors, or worse, bring accusations that your family wasn't properly upholding cultural norms. It wasn't just isolated embarrassment. Something as small as the wrong kimono pattern at the wrong time could ruin relationships. Festivals were especially tricky. Everyone had to outdo themselves to look respectable without overstepping. And getting it wrong could bring shame not only to you, but to your entire household. Your grandmother would probably hear about it too. even if she lived in another village. What you wear isn't just about clothing, it's about rank, ritual, and surviving daily judgment from both heaven and your mother-in-law. That pretty much summed it up. This intricate moral pressure extended to the smallest of details. Let's say a young woman borrowed her sister's hair comb for a festival without realizing it was too elegant for her station. That comb, a small accessory, might cause whispers among the other attendees. People would wonder if her family was overstepping boundaries or trying to climb beyond their place. And because word traveled fast in tightly knit communities, the whispers would reach her parents. Dressing above your place in society wasn't just arrogance. It was seen as a failure of the family to teach their children humility. It's hard to imagine this kind of pressure in today's world, where styles are as varied and unfixed as the people who wear them. Jeans with rips in them, perfectly acceptable. Gold chains on someone working a minimum wage job, not unusual. Dress codes exist today, sure, but you'll seldom hear about public shaming, exile, or worse for failing to fit in. Back then, even the slightest deviation was a social risk, one you couldn't afford to take. Imagine trying to navigate this kind of complexity. You'd wake up every morning, stare at your limited clothing options, and mentally review every social rule you could think of. What day is it? Does this pattern say the wrong thing about my family? Is this fabric too nice? Is it too worn in? Am I showing just enough respect to the hierarchy without accidentally breaking the unspoken rule of know your place? Every choice was a minefield, and getting it wrong didn't just cost you respect. It could cost you your livelihood or even your safety. And the irony of it all, even those at the top of the social ladder weren't free from scrutiny. A samurai dressed too finely might be seen as arrogant or detached from his duties. A daimyo whose robes appeared overly plain might invite whispers of declining fortunes. This constant pressure to communicate through clothing wasn't freeing. It was suffocating, a system of control hidden in plain sight. So, next time you throw on a t-shirt and sweatpants, consider how lucky you are to live in a world where comfort doesn't come with consequences. You can wear mismatched socks, clashing colors, or the wrong patterns for every season, and no one's going to call the local samurai to correct your fashion misstep. In feudal Japan, one small slip in your wardrobe didn't just ruin your morning, it could ruin your life. Fashion wasn't just survival, it was submission. But in a world so obsessed with societal control, there was one place where freedom still couldn't breathe. Even when it came to marriage, or rather, the lack of choice in it, love wasn't something that conquered all. Instead, it was another duty dictated by rank and expectations. Think love conquers all. In feudal Japan, love didn't even make it to the battlefield. Marriage wasn't about moonlit walks beneath cherry blossoms or whispered poetry under paper lanterns. And if you're imagining a dramatic kiss between a samurai and some forbidden princess, no. Marriage, especially in the samurai class, was less about heartstrings and more about political alliances. A marriage wasn't an expression of love. It was a chess move to secure land, strengthen clan bonds, or settle debts. Your feelings, completely irrelevant. You were a piece in a much bigger game, one you had no say in. Here's how it worked. Your family decided your marital fate, usually long before you even understood what it meant. Fathers negotiated, envoys exchanged gifts, and whichever family had the most to gain made the arrangements. The couple, they might meet for the first time on their wedding day, staring across the elaborate ceremony with as much romantic spark as two strangers on a bus. Compatibility, never a concern. It didn't matter if your personalities clashed, or if the mere sight of your intended made your gut churn. The marriage wasn't about you. It was about duty. What you wanted, who you loved, or whether or not you'd even get along. That wasn't part of the discussion. Now, if you're a samurai, the stakes for marriage were even higher. Your clan's future rested on alliances, and your marriage could mark a turning point for everyone involved. For daughters, this was especially heavy. You were expected to master skills like calligraphy, etiquette, and needlework, not because they were fulfilling, but because they made you a good match. Your role wasn't to find joy or freedom. It was to uphold the family's reputation. And to make matters worse, you were expected to do it with a smile, suppressing any outward sign of unhappiness or disappointment. Your value was tied to your usefulness as a wife and mother, measured in sons rather than personal fulfillment. For a samurai man, the choice wasn't much freer. Family heads decided who you'd marry, not because they thought she'd make you happy, but because of what her family could offer. Maybe her clan owned land near an important border, or had close ties to a powerful daimyo. Maybe her family owed yours a favor. The reasons could be anything but romance. And after the wedding, your emotional connection, if one developed at all, was secondary to the structure you had to maintain. You were there to carry on the family line, manage the household, and act as a symbol of your clan's stability. Love wasn't forbidden, but it was inconvenient. So what happened if, by some unplanned twist of fate, you fell in love with someone outside these arrangements? Simple. It became a problem. Love was relegated to the realm of poets, playwrights, and actors. It was something you read about, not something you experienced. In art and literature, love could flourish in tragic ghost stories or dramatic kabuki plays. But in real life, social norms crushed those emotions flat. A samurai duty-bound to a politically arranged marriage wasn't going to run off with the flute teacher or risk a scandal with a merchant's daughter. Trying to act on such feelings would bring shame on your entire household, a weight few willingly carried. Now imagine this playing out in your own life. You're 15 years old, and your parents have just informed you of your engagement. You're going to marry the eldest son of so-and-so, a family with an excellent reputation and plenty of connections. You don't know him, of course, but your father assures you this is an excellent match. His family's political ties will secure your clan standing. Your duty, meanwhile, is simple. Learn to serve tea perfectly. Walk without making a sound. Be polite, modest, and above all, obedient. Love, if you're lucky, you might learn to tolerate each other after a few years. The wedding itself would be a lavish event, but not because anyone cared about what you wanted. Your outfit, your gestures, even your bow during the ceremony had to fit the mold of perfection, reflecting well on both families. And after it was over, you'd step into the quiet, controlled world of your new household, unsure of how this stranger you'd married would treat you. You'd bow, serve tea, and suppress the creeping feeling that your life was now entirely defined by someone else's decisions. And if you think women bore the heaviest burden in these arrangements, you're not wrong. For women, marriage narrowed your world to a single focus: the household. Your primary job was to have children, preferably boys, and ensure the family line continued. Everything else was secondary. If you were lucky, you might have small moments of freedom, like managing household finances or overseeing servants. But these weren't privileges. They were obligations wrapped in authority. Love wasn't part of the equation, and any attempt to pursue it outside your marriage could lead to disastrous consequences. For men, the rules were slightly more flexible. Slightly. A samurai husband might take a concubine or mistress, but only if it didn't upset the family reputation or interfere with his duties. But for a woman, stepping outside the bounds of marriage wasn't just risky, it was unthinkable. And this wasn't just about the samurai. Peasants too faced similar restrictions in their marriages. While their unions weren't tied to high-stakes political alliances, they were still heavily influenced by practicality and family expectations. Marrying for love wasn't a priority. Instead, your partner was chosen based on what they could contribute to the household, their ability to work, their connections in the village, or their family's reputation. Compatibility or attraction took a backseat to survival and stability. If love blossomed between the cracks of these utilitarian relationships, it was more accident than design. Of course, that doesn't mean people didn't fall in love. They did. But love was often painfully inconvenient. You could feel it, but never act on it, much less speak about it openly. Imagine secretly harboring feelings for someone you weren't allowed to marry, watching them from across the room during a festival, knowing those stolen glances were the closest you'd ever get. Love wasn't forbidden exactly. It just didn't fit anywhere in the tight structure of your life. And so, it stayed on the fringes, in private moments, in longing stares, or in the hands of poets who wrote about it as if it existed in another world entirely. Interestingly, this tension between love and duty filled the art and literature of the time. Kabuki theatre, for example, thrived on stories of forbidden love, star-crossed couples willing to sacrifice everything to be together, only to meet tragic ends. These stories resonated so deeply with audiences because they highlighted what real life so often denied. On stage, love could break barriers and defy expectations. In real life, it rarely had the chance. The deeper irony here is that love was celebrated in art, but stifled in practice. People could read about grand romantic gestures in poetry, or watch them play out in a kabuki play, but they couldn't indulge in them. Society demanded obedience, and obedience left little room for personal happiness. You did what was expected. You fulfilled your role. And if love happened to knock softly on the door of your life, you ignored it, because opening that door could mean losing everything. For most people in feudal Japan, this was simply the way things worked. Personal fulfillment wasn't the end goal. Stability, duty, and the continuity of the family or clan took precedence, even if it meant sacrificing your own desires. Marriage wasn't a chance to find your other half. It was a transaction, sealed and maintained for the greater good. Now, if you're sitting there wondering how anyone survived this, you wouldn't be alone. The contrast between modern relationships, with apps, choices, and sprawling timelines to figure things out, and feudal Japan's rigid structure couldn't be starker. One arranged marriage, and you'd probably be longing for something as casual as swiping left or right. The sheer lack of personal freedom in relationships back then would make even the most awkward modern dating experiences look like paradise. But while love might have been out of reach for most people, history does remind us that individuality, even brilliance, couldn't always be wiped out by societal norms. In rare cases, someone bucked the system in ways no one ever expected. Take Artemisia of Caria, for instance, a woman and a warrior who rewrote her destiny in a world built for men. Ever wonder how far you'd make it in a world where breaking barriers wasn't applauded, but condemned? For Artemisia of Caria, there wasn't much time to think about what was socially acceptable. She was too busy making history. A Greek by lineage, Persian by loyalty, and a woman who commanded entire fleets in an age dominated by men who barely acknowledged her right to stand among them. She was anything but ordinary. In the midst of the Greco-Persian Wars, Artemisia rewrote every rule about what a woman could be by doing exactly what she wasn't supposed to, outshining many of the men around her. First, let's set the scene. Artemisia was the ruler of Halicarnassus, a city in what is now modern-day Turkey. Her father, likely Carian, and her Cretan mother gave her a mix of identities that only made her journey more complicated. She existed in the margins, not fully Greek in allegiance, not quite wholly Persian either, and all the while facing a world that treated her gender as its own disqualifier. Yet, here she was, not just navigating these complexities, but excelling while others stumbled. She didn't just defy norms, she crushed them underfoot. Her rise to prominence was tied closely to Xerxes, the ruler of the Persian Empire, whose invasion of Greece was one of the largest military endeavors of the ancient world. Xerxes had an enormous army, countless ships, and an ego to match. He surrounded himself with officers and advisors ready to nod along with whatever plan crossed his mind. Artemisia, strikingly, didn't fit that mold. She was known for blunt honesty, delivering advice laced with warnings others were too afraid to voice. Beneath the pomp of Xerxes' grand ambitions, she became, against all odds, one of his most trusted commanders. Let that sink in for a second. In a time when women weren't seen as military leaders, she wasn't just tolerated, she was valued. But Artemisia's fame, or infamy, depending on who you ask, hinges largely on one event, the Battle of Salamis, a naval clash between the Persian fleet and the Greek forces. It was one of the most decisive moments in the Greco-Persian Wars. Artemisia, as one of Xerxes' naval commanders, steered her fleet into the heart of one of the ancient world's greatest confrontations. And she didn't just survive it, she made a cunning, ruthless decision that carved her name into the marble of history. Picture this. The narrow straits of Salamis are chaos. Ships are ramming into each other, sailors are shouting over the crunch of wood and steel, and the Persian fleet, despite its size, is being outmaneuvered by the smaller, faster Greek triremes. Somewhere in the middle of this pandemonium is Artemisia, commanding her ship. A Greek vessel spots her and gives chase. She has no allies nearby to defend her, no clear route to escape. And in that moment, she does something unthinkable. She turns her ship toward one of her own allied vessels and rams it, sending it to the depths. Now, if that sounds extreme, you're right. Sinking an ally ship isn't found in any playbook. But Artemisia wasn't about playing by the book. She was about survival. Her calculated gamble worked perfectly. The Greek forces, assuming she must be on their side after witnessing the attack, let her pass unharmed. Meanwhile, the Persian ship she destroyed, it sank with its crew, collateral damage in Artemisia's audacious escape. People often refer to this moment as ruthless, but it's more than that. It's bold, strategic, and indifferent to the polite rules of loyalty. She prioritized survival, something leaders of all genders have always quietly done but rarely admit. When news of the incident reached Xerxes, he didn't condemn her for the loss of an allied ship. On the contrary, he praised her for her cunning. According to historian Herodotus, Xerxes reportedly said, "My men have become women, and my women men." A remark that, while drenched in ancient sexism, underscores the effect she had. She didn't just exceed Xerxes' expectations, she obliterated them. Where others might have buckled under the pressure of scrutiny or hesitated in the face of danger, Artemisia leaned into the chaos and thrived. Speaking of Herodotus, much of what we know about Artemisia comes from his accounts. He was from Halicarnassus, her home city, so his views on her are layered with a mix of admiration and ambivalence. He describes her as calculating and pragmatic, someone who could look at a situation with absolute clarity, even if it meant making decisions that would seem cold to others. It's not just her act of sinking the Allied ship that stands out in his writings. Her advice to Xerxes during the war reveals a sharp mind unclouded by bravado. She warned him not to engage the Greeks in a naval battle, foreseeing the tactical disadvantages of the Straits of Salamis. Of course, he didn't listen. Rulers seldom do. Her warnings turned out to be correct, though Xerxes' ultimate defeat hardly tarnished her reputation in his eyes. If anything, Artemisia's blend of courage and pragmatism made her even more exceptional. She wasn't operating from a position of unchecked privilege or entitlement. Greek by blood, Persian by loyalty, a woman leading men. Every shred of her identity gave the world an excuse to doubt her. Yet, she didn't just hold her own. She outmaneuvered many of the men who surrounded her, proving time and again that she deserved her place in history. It's tempting to frame her as an anomaly, an exception to the rule. And maybe in some ways she was. But Artemisia's story is also a reminder that individuality can't always be suppressed by societal norms. There's something universal in her willingness to defy the expectations placed upon her. In an age when everything was stacked against her, she charted her own course, literally and figuratively, across the treacherous waters of history. Of course, she wasn't universally admired. Her actions, particularly at Salamis, were met with no shortage of criticism, especially from Greek accounts of the time. It's important to remember that any woman in power back then operated under a microscope. Men in similar positions might be praised for pragmatism or cunning, but for Artemisia, the same qualities often earned suspicion or condemnation. Her legacy, as preserved through Herodotus, reflects this tension. Respect for her brilliance tangled with unease at her defiance of social norms. But maybe that's exactly why she stands out. Artemisia of Caria wasn't defined by the rules of her time. She broke them, twisted them, and used them to her advantage. Her story isn't just one of survival on the battlefield. It's a testament to the power of clarity, strategy, and sheer nerve. Courage doesn't always look like a hero on horseback charging into the fray. Sometimes it looks like a woman steadying her hands on the helm of a ship, sinking an ally, and sailing through the storm while the world looks on in disbelief. So what does Artemisia teach us? Courage, in its truest form, isn't about being fearless. It's about knowing exactly what's at stake and acting anyway. It's about recognizing when the world has underestimated you and proving them wrong. Artemisia didn't just survive in a world built to exclude her. She thrived in it. Her actions, sometimes controversial, always deliberate, earned her a place in a history that rarely makes room for women. And even now, thousands of years later, her story serves as a sharp reminder that strength has no single form. While Artemisia commanded her fleet and defied societal norms, ancient civilizations were looking up, not to leaders, but to the heavens. They sought meaning in the stars, and their observations would shape the foundations of astronomy. One moment of human strategy, one eternal gaze into the sky, both part of the same fascinating mosaic of ancient history. Feudal Japan wasn't just a test of strength, it was a masterclass in survival. Every moment, From ice-cold morning rituals to nights spent adhering to suffocating codes, demanded resilience in ways that feel almost unthinkable now. The rigid systems of class, honor, and tradition left no room for error. Whether you were a samurai weighing every step or a peasant tied to endless fields of rice. So next time modern life feels overwhelming, remember, at least you aren't washing in a stream or watching your words for fear of exile. History shows how much we can endure, even when life feels impossible.